Taehyung had never been the loudest voice in the room, but he had always been the most magnetic. People listened when he spoke, not because he raised his tone, but because he carried a gravity that didn't require volume. That night, gravity shifted. The live television interview was supposed to be routine, the kind where celebrities smile, answer lightly, promote politely, and leave. A controlled exchange designed to keep everyone comfortable, especially the host, who believed dominance came naturally with the chair, the mic, and the spotlight pointed his way. The narrative belonged to him, or so he thought. Taehyung walked onto the set with a calm that felt rehearsed only by experience, not by media coaching. His posture relaxed, his gaze observant, his expression neutral in the way that makes people curious instead of threatened. The studio expected a pop star. What they received was a man who understood the architecture of conversation better than the person asking the questions. The host opened confidently, leaning into the kind of probing tone that had worked for him countless times before. He enjoyed the theater of live reactions, the small stumbles, the emotional cracks, the sound of a guest shrinking just slightly under a cleverly framed question. It was a rhythm he trusted. Taehyung didn't disrupt the rhythm. He waited for it to finish. The question arrived like a spark engineered to ignite a reaction. It wasn't clever. It was predictable. And predictability is dangerous when the audience can already see the outline of the trap before it closes. Taehyung inhaled once slowly, not like someone bracing for impact, but like someone measuring the moment before defining it. When he finally spoke, it wasn't defensive. It wasn't emotional. It wasn't performative. It was precise. His words landed without tremor, not a clapback delivered for applause, but a statement delivered for silence. The kind that forces a room to reconsider who is interviewing whom. The host tried to respond, but language is weak when it follows something airtight. There was no crack to widen, no emotion to leverage, no uncertainty to weaponize. So the room did what rooms do when they witness something they can't immediately categorize. It went quiet. Quiet not as defeat but as acknowledgement. The audience felt it instantly. This was not another celebrity interview moment. This was a narrative inversion. Because the biggest shocks are not born from chaos. They are born from contrast. The silence in the studio wasn't brief. It lingered, stretching longer than any commercial break ever planned for tension. Silence when accidental feels awkward. Silence when earned feels historical. This silence felt earned. Taehyung sat back slightly after delivering his reply, not with satisfaction, but with a calm that suggested the conversation had already reached the only conclusion that mattered. The host, still leaning forward just moments earlier like a man conducting an orchestra of provocation, now looked more like a man who had misplaced the score entirely. The broadcast crew behind the cameras exchanged glances that were never meant to be part of the show. The kind of glances that carry no script direction, no teleprompter cue, no producer instruction. These were human glances, signaling the moment had slipped out of format and into consequence. The clip from the interview was now spreading faster than the network could caption it. Not spreading through outrage, but through curiosity. People were replaying it not to pick sides, but to understand how someone who was expected to perform softness could instead deliver clarity sharp enough to rearrange the emotional furniture of a live broadcast. Taehyung had not spoken like someone attacking a person. He had spoken like someone correcting a narrative. And narratives, once corrected publicly, refuse to sit quietly in archives. They walk back into the present every time someone presses play again. The audience outside the studio was louder than the room inside it. Not loud in volume, but loud in participation. They were sharing the moment with captions that sounded like disbelief, pride, identification, revelation, humor, admiration, and generational recognition. Comments weren't asking if Taehyung was right. They were asking why the system had assumed he would be easy to corner in the first place. Cornering works only when the subject believes the corner exists. Taehyung never believed in corners. He had been performing in open arenas long enough to know that space belongs to whoever understands it emotionally first, not whoever is positioned to control it institutionally at all. Backstage directors began debating if the segment should be reframed as controversy. But controversy requires emotional instability. Taehyung had given none. Instability had been supplied by the system's own surprise, not by the guest's response. And surprise without instability is not controversy. It is a spotlight shift. Taehyung had not stolen the spotlight. The spotlight had abandoned its original subject willingly, the moment the audience realized who deserved to be seen under it more clearly. The system was used to framing stars as reactive personalities. It was not used to stars framing the system back with nothing but composure and cultural fluency. One producer whispered the real problem aloud. He speaks like someone who has watched this show before. And he had. Not this show specifically, but the format itself. The format where institutions test artists publicly, expecting reaction, expecting cracks, expecting ego, expecting trembling, expecting apology optics, expecting emotional bargaining. But Taehyung had never bargained for narrative ownership. He had never needed to. Ownership is not demanded anymore. Ownership is demonstrated. And he had demonstrated it like someone placing a period at the end of a long, inherited sentence of underestimation. The host had asked a question expecting rupture. He received punctuation instead. And punctuation, once spoken calmly by a global star on live TV, becomes permanent grammar for everyone watching closely enough to feel the moment change hands. The internet moves like weather, but not the predictable kind meteorologists enjoy charting on morning news. It moves like a sudden storm forming over warm ocean water no satellite detected early enough. Taehyung had created warm ocean water in a cold studio, and the world outside had begun generating the storm for him. The network had expected control because it understood broadcast packing. Taehyung had won because he understood audience patience. Patience is the silent engine behind every long replay loop, every shared moment, every reaction stitched into digital commentary, every viewer returning because the story feels like a slow burn instead of a flash fire. And slow burns travel farther because they give people time to climb inside the narrative emotionally, instead of being pushed into it aggressively at all. Taehyung's comeback wasn't trending because it was sharp. It was trending because it sounded true, delivered in a tone that refused to tremble, crack, or escalate theatrically. Television trains hosts to extract emotion. The internet trains audiences to detect authenticity faster than emotion can be extracted. Authenticity cannot be extracted. It can only be recognized when someone refuses to perform anything other than consequence. Media analysts across rival networks were watching the clip now like a breach of protocol they wished they had engineered themselves. But engineering a moment is not the same as owning it. Taehyung had not engineered the cameras, the studio, the lighting, the mic setup, or the host's tone. He had simply engineered the one thing institutions cannot replicate on command: human inevitability. What happened next was not about argument. It was about impact, the kind that makes people lean forward without being told to, because the story is unfolding like a mystery they didn't expect to find themselves starring in emotionally at all. The host tried to recover the conversation, but recovery language is thin when it follows something carved from lived experience. He was searching for emotional leverage, but leverage requires instability. Taehyung had given none. The instability belonged to the network, the host, the producers, the sponsors, the editorial consultants, the broadcast gatekeepers, and every institutional voice that suddenly sounded like it had been reading from cue cards invisible to the public, until Taehyung made them visible simply by refusing to play small at all. Meanwhile, Taehyung was not speaking again publicly. He was not posting a follow-up clarification. He was not extending the moment intentionally. Intentional extension is a tactic institutions use. Organic extension is a reward. The audience issues itself when the moment feels native to them emotionally. And this moment felt native. Native to a generation that hates being spoken down to, not because they are rebellious, but because they are fluent in sincerity detection. Fluent in media literacy without needing media degrees. Fluent in the emotional mathematics of contrast, where calm dismantles provocation more cleanly than shouting ever could. Fluent in the architecture of virality, where silence after truth becomes negative space too valuable for platforms not to fill with commentary, analysis, remixes, translations, memes, duets, reaction breakdowns, shared disbelief, shared pride, shared exhaustion at stereotype narratives, shared humor at institutional surprise, shared admiration at a star refusing to tremble, and shared realization that a pop artist had just conducted the conversation without conducting it loudly at all. By the time the network tried framing the clip as a scandal, the audience had already framed it as a mirror. A mirror showing the limits of institutional certainty when confronted not by outrage, but by composure that sounds human, intentional, fluent, empathetic without pleading, sharp without theatrics, confident without shouting, authentic without ornament, and impossible to shrink because the world outside had begun expanding the moment faster than broadcast budgets ever planned for narrative scale at all. If institutions meant outrage, audiences meant legacy. Taehyung had minted legacy simply by speaking like someone who had carried silence on stadium stages long enough to know that silence, when placed after truth, trends longer than disruption ever does. And the world was still replaying it. Not because he shouted back at a host, but because he corrected a narrative calmly enough for millions to hear themselves inside the sentence, instead of hearing television inside it at all. The aftermath didn't feel like television anymore. It felt like digital archaeology, millions digging through the moment frame by frame, sentence by sentence, micro-expression by micro-expression, extracting meaning the network never intended to embed, but accidentally had by placing a man like Taehyung inside a system that assumed public voices were decorative instead of consequential at all. Within hours, every broadcast competitor was facing an internal question it didn't want asked out loud. Why didn't we host this first? But no one can host sincerity retroactively. You either broadcast a real moment, or you broadcast regret wrapped in pundit costume pretending it was intentional media strategy at all. Taehyung had disappeared from public comment intentionally after the broadcast, not as a tactic, but as a consequence of exhaustion. Real exhaustion is not a performance state. It is a credibility certificate the audience trusts more than any media credential printed on glossy journalism pamphlets handed out at conferences no one watches longer than a commercial break at all. The network, meanwhile, was scrambling to issue statements, but statements issued in panic have the structural integrity of wet paper held too close to studio lights. Taehyung's words were spreading faster not because they were scandalous, but because they were portable. Portable across cultures, portable across languages, portable across social strata, portable across emotional states, portable because they sounded like spoken experience instead of scripted opinion. Portable because they required no amplification. Portable because the audience carried the echo itself. Experts began publishing op-eds questioning celebrity political competence, but competence is not the currency that had gone viral. Relevance was. Taehyung was relevant not because he debated politics like a politician. He was relevant because he spoke human consequence like someone who had seen the cost of silence personally, socially, culturally, emotionally, and existentially enough to know that credibility doesn't require podium invitations. It requires lived receipts the world has felt, but never heard spoken this cleanly on live broadcast at all. A star doesn't need a political degree to sound true. A journalist doesn't need a conscience to sound practiced. Practice is not truth. It's muscle memory wearing truth's clothing. Taehyung had not worn clothing. He had worn honesty without ornament. And honesty without ornament is the scariest kind for institutions because it gives them nothing to discredit stylistically, narratively, academically, emotionally, or strategically at all. Backstage footage surfaced of producers shaking their heads, whispering, packing, calling executives, refreshing social feeds like stock tickers, watching their assumptions collapse at the speed of public belief, migrating from television authority to crowdsourced witness authority they could not throttle, moderate, mute, delay, filter, downplay, classify, or frame correct fast enough at all. Viewers were not just watching the clip, they were inhabiting it. Inhabiting because it didn't insult their intelligence, didn't weaponize their emotions cheaply, didn't escalate theatrically, didn't simplify complexity insultingly, didn't gatekeep moral authority institutionally, and most importantly, didn't rush the viewer out of the moment before they had time to recognize themselves emotionally inside the story at all. A one-hour show usually fades in memory by dinner. This one was becoming generational folklore by breakfast. Not because it was loud, but because it was still. Stillness is the predecessor to disbelief turning into resolve. Stillness is the emotional pause between provocation and consequence, where audiences decide loyalty silently before they decide it socially at all. Stillness is what made the studio lights feel interrogative instead of celebratory. Stillness is what made the cue cards tremble. Stillness is what made the network realize that the scariest broadcast takeover is when someone steals airtime loudly. Silence has many textures. There is the silence of avoidance, the silence of grief, the silence of intimidation, and the silence of surrender. The network had experienced all four in the span of a single broadcast cycle. Taehyung had experienced the fifth kind, the silence of impact, the kind that doesn't retreat, but expands outward like a vacuum demanding to be filled by voices that had waited too long for a space wide enough to hold them at all. While Liberty now tried repairing its image publicly, Taehyung was not repairing anything. Repair implies damage. He had not been damaged by the confrontation. He had been clarified by it. Clarification is what happens when someone speaks truth in a system that expected spectacle, and instead delivers testimony so calm it destabilizes the broadcast scaffolding, holding the entire media illusion upright at all. Public attention was now splitting into factions. Some viewers claimed Taehyung had crossed a line, but lines only exist when drawn by institutions confident enough to enforce them narratively. This institution was no longer confident. It was flinching at every replay. You cannot enforce a boundary you can no longer defend emotionally, intellectually, publicly, or institutionally at all. Others were asking a more dangerous question. If Taehyung is wrong, why does his wrong sound more human than your right? Human truth is not always correct factually, but it is always believable emotionally. Emotional believability travels farther than factual correctness ever does when institutions have spent too long confusing fluency with legitimacy and legitimacy with moral ownership at all. Rival networks were preparing analysis segments dissecting his comeback, but dissection requires a subject who keeps performing. Taehyung was not performing anymore. He had withdrawn into public quiet, leaving behind a crater of commentary, reaction, reinterpretation, and collective recognition, forming new narrative weather systems institutions could not forecast accurately because forecasting sincerity is not a discipline taught at media universities at all. Fans were not defending him with arguments, they were defending him with presence. Presence is the currency institutions fear most because it doesn't require refutation. You cannot refute loyalty expressed as attendance, umbrellas in the rain, vigil lights, shared clips, emotional echoing, or generational recognition at all. Human rights groups began amplifying the clip not as a political statement, but as a cultural inflection point. Inflection points are not about who is right or wrong. They are about when the narrative bends so sharply, the audience realizes it has been leaning in the opposite direction for too long without noticing at all. Taehyung had not shouted to bend the narrative. He had whispered to break the axis. Meanwhile, inside Liberty Media headquarters, executives were discovering a new kind of instability, the instability of representation. Representation does not need permission when it is recognized by millions before institutions finish drafting their response packets at all. Taehyung had represented a voice institutions had spent decades editing into caricature. The celebrity who should stay small, smile, sing, dance, avoid consequence, avoid weight, avoid complexity, avoid grief, avoid testimony, avoid moral disruption, avoid political metaphor, avoid existential confrontation, avoid silence, avoid impact, avoid anything not decorative, avoid the implication that cultural relevance might also mean moral legitimacy without institutional certification at all. But relevance had already chosen him. And relevance does not apologize to institutions. Taehyung's comeback was not viral because it was brutal. It was viral because it was unshrinkable. Unshrinkable because he had not spoken as a politician, journalist, activist, or academic. He had spoken as someone who had occupied stadium silence long enough to know that silence is not absence when audiences carry the echo themselves at all. By the sixth segment of this unfolding saga, the world was no longer debating a comeback on live television. It was debating a fracture in the media mirror that could not be glued back into its original shape. The network thought the confrontation had damaged its brand. The public knew it had damaged its authority, which is a structure far older, heavier, and more brittle than any brand identity polished by consultants in focus groups designed to sanitize complexity, until it fits into a consumer attention span no one respects anymore at all. Taehyung had not returned to social media to clarify his words. Clarification is an institutional reflex. Taehyung had left clarity on the table like a lit match placed beside paper soaked in years of editorial perfume, masking the smell of manufactured narratives that always seemed stable, until someone with nothing to prove except presence walks into the studio and refuses to behave like a punctuation mark in someone else's argument at all. And presence was what terrified them, because presence does not need amplification. It needs recognition. And recognition had already happened globally. Inside Liberty Media's upper floors, legal teams were assembling contingency language, preparing carefully neutral statements that sounded like responsibility wearing crisis management shoes. But crisis management shoes cannot run fast enough when the audience has already migrated from broadcast legitimacy to crowd legitimacy. Crowd legitimacy is not awarded through credentials. It is awarded through resonance, the kind that feels like collective autobiography whispered back by millions who had carried their own silence too long to be mocked by institutions that confuse composure with competence and competence with moral ownership at all. Taehyung had spoken composure, not politics. The host had spoken politics, not composure. That contrast had rewritten the hierarchy of believability, not academically, not strategically, not journalistically, but emotionally, where hierarchy bends faster because it is built from human nervous systems reacting before institutions finish drafting their second paragraph at all. The network had tried controlling the moment once. The world had replayed it 30 million times before morning. And replay is not consumption. Replay is testimony turning into folklore. By the time Liberty now issued a public apology, the apology sounded less like accountability and more like an acoustic illusion, reverberating inside boardrooms instead of stadiums, written to soothe investors instead of people, calibrated to sound responsible instead of true, delivered in a tone that wanted forgiveness before understanding, offered too early to mean anything, offered too late to change anything, and most damning of all, offered in a format that suggested the audience still believed institutional microphones were sacred instead of rentable at all. But sacred microphones tremble when held by people without conscience. Rentable microphones become sacred when held by people without fear. Taehyung had held the mic without trembling. And that was the tremor. Rival networks were now offering interview invitations, not to extract political opinion, but to extract moral consequence. Moral consequence is what institutions fear most because it cannot be framed as a publicity stunt. It cannot be reframed as youthful rebellion. It cannot be dismissed as emotional volatility. It cannot be shrink-labeled into celebrity incompetence. It cannot be moderated through broadcast delay switches. It cannot be buried in editorial footnotes. No one reads longer than a headline at all. Taehyung had not become a political figure. He had become a narrative fault line. Fault lines do not ask for legitimacy. They expose the ground's instability retroactively. And now the ground beneath Liberty Media was retroactively unstable, not because Taehyung had shouted them down, but because he had spoken human consequence calmly enough that millions could replay it without feeling manipulated, insulted, categorized, framed, gatekept, corrected, delayed, moderated, editorialized, infantilized, or broadcast managed at all. A star who speaks like a witness is more dangerous than a journalist who speaks like a judge. A witness carries faces. A judge carries rules. Rules can be rewritten. Faces cannot be ignored when recognition has already happened globally at all. Taehyung had not destroyed the host. He had destroyed the assumption that celebrity voices must sound decorative to be tolerated by institutions at all. And that destruction was quiet enough to echo for generations. By the 7th chapter of this collision between broadcast arrogance and cultural consequence, Taehyung was no longer being treated like a guest star in someone else's interview segment. He was being treated like a referendum, the public held without ballots, without podiums, without institutions officiating, without panel moderators summarizing what had already summarized itself emotionally across continents at all. Liberty Now's former host, Eric Sullivan, had posted one final video claiming censorship, defamation, and orchestrated outrage. But censorship narratives only survive when the audience believes institutional microphones are sacred, scarce, or sovereign at all. The audience had already discovered the microphones were abundant. What was scarce was conscience. What was sovereign was resonance. And what was sacred was whoever stopped performing for institutions and started speaking to people at all. Taehyung, meanwhile, had not posted rebuttals. He had not issued counter-narratives. He had not weaponized the moment further. Institutions escalate. Audiences canonize. Escalation is a tactic. Canonization is a reward. Taehyung had earned the reward not by escalating, but by withdrawing, which paradoxically extended the moment farther than any deliberate amplification strategy ever could. Because silence, when placed after truth, behaves differently than silence placed instead of it. It behaves like negative space audiences rush to caption themselves. The corporate apology had failed not because it lacked polish, but because it lacked memory. Corporate apologies are written for the present. Legacy is written by the past leaking into the present through a voice that refuses to sound engineered by public relations consultants trained to treat conscience like a broadcast asset instead of a human prerequisite at all. Taehyung's words traveled farther than Eric's defense not because they were political, but because they were personal without being self-centered, personal enough to carry human cost, personal enough to sound like lived experience, personal enough to make institutions flinch, but not so personal that it shrank into celebrity autobiography instead of expanding into collective recognition audiences had been waiting to issue themselves at all. The public had not rallied around Taehyung because he attacked a media figure. The public rallied because he attacked the hierarchy that allowed media figures to sneer like gatekeepers instead of speak like witnesses at all. Inside newsrooms worldwide, resignations continued. Not dramatic walkouts, quiet departures, notes left on desks, ID badges returned without speeches, writers refusing to keep shaping narratives that sound compassionate until compassion is required publicly at all, producers refusing to cut clips that cut back morally, editors refusing to trim conscience into sound bites, so short they can fit inside stereotypes audiences, stopped respecting long before social platforms were even profitable at all. Movements had begun, not because Taehyung screamed, but because Taehyung spoke once clearly enough, calmly enough, personally enough, culturally enough, morally enough, historically enough, and universally enough that the world kept replaying it without needing institutional narrators to officiate what had already officiated itself emotionally at all. A system exposed cannot be covered by apologies. A mirror cracked cannot be reframed by statements. A voice canonized cannot be moderated by credentials. And silence that follows truth cannot be classified as absence ever again at all. Taehyung had not become invincible. He had become unignorable. Unignorable is not a celebrity state. It is a generational inevitability, certificate the public issues when institutions have spent too long confusing broadcast reach with moral legitimacy, and moral legitimacy with editorial permission at all. And editorial permission was the one currency Taehyung never asked for. Because the public had already granted something older, heavier, and more permanent than permission. Recognition without negotiation. The eighth movement of this story didn't begin with cameras. It began with corridors, the kind built from marble, polished by institutions that assumed history only happened when broadcast crews were invited to document it professionally at all. Corridors don't trend, but consequences do, and the consequence of Taehyung's live rebuttal had now reached places where broadcast arrogance once felt permanent enough to behave like unquestionable infrastructure, instead of a stage prop, rented nightly at all. Invitations began arriving, not polite industry bookings, not entertainment scheduling, not marketing collaborations disguised as interviews. These were invitations that carried institutional handwriting, embossed seals, logistical gravity, procedural weight, diplomatic undertones, and most dangerously, curiosity that sounded like it had been rehearsing authority until curiosity was required publicly at all. The UN invited him. The Human Rights Council wanted a cultural testimony. The Ethics Tribunal wanted to hear him as a representative of public conscience, a role no pop star had ever occupied formally in global media proceedings before at all. The letters were phrased like obligation. The world read them like inevitability, and inevitability does not tremble when it arrives. It simply occupies the seat institutions once assumed belonged to them exclusively at all. Taehyung did not react like a man flattered by the sudden gravity. He reacted like someone who had carried gravity silently on stadium stages for years, long enough to know that institutional spotlight is not the same as audience illumination. One blinds you, the other sees you. Taehyung had been seen by millions long before institutions decided he might also be useful rhetorically, diplomatically, morally, socially, politically, journalistically, culturally, academically, procedurally, historically, or existentially at all. Meanwhile, Liberty Media's internal chaos was not subsiding. Internal chaos never subsides quietly when the public has begun narrating louder through repetition than institutions ever narrated through amplification at all. Competitors were looping the clip like an unofficial cultural inflection point. Scholars were quoting his sentence architecture. Professors were teaching contrast. Activists were citing composure as rhetoric. Journalists were questioning editorial reflexes. Producers were auditing moral leverage. And interns were realizing broadcast hierarchies collapse fastest not when attacked, but when exposed to a voice that refuses to behave like decoration inside someone else's argument at all. By this point, Taehyung had not become a political figure. He had become a media inevitability crisis, certificate the public issued before institutions realized the public was minting certificates at all. The next broadcast appearance he would make, if he ever made one again, would not be a debate. It would not be a rebuttal. It would not be a publicity stunt framed as irony by crisp-suited hosts educated to extract emotion like leverage instead of deliver truth like testimony at all. It would be something bigger, colder, calmer, sharper, personal without shrinking, emotional without theatrics, moral without pleading, human without trembling, cultural without permission, diplomatic without rehearsal, and most dangerously, honest enough that broadcast engineers would have nothing left to engineer narratively at all. The public was no longer watching Taehyung like an idol. They were watching him like a threshold event. Threshold events are not loud by default. They are silent until crossed. Taehyung had crossed it once. The world was now crossing it after him. The ninth stretch of this story unfolded not like a broadcast segment, but like a ripple pattern spreading across still water long after the stone had sunk. The stone was Taehyung's voice. The water was a media ecosystem that believed it could measure impact by decibels, when real impact had always been measured by emotional migration instead. Audiences quietly relocating their belief from anchors who posture to witnesses who speak like they've carried silence long enough to know when to break it at all. Liberty Media had already sacrificed its host, but sacrificing a face does not absolve a structure. Structures collapse only when the public stops asking for apologies and starts asking for accountability that sounds human, procedural, moral, culturally literate, historically informed, universally portable, emotionally recognizable, institutionally inconvenient, and impossible to reframe, because it never arrived inside a frame to begin with at all. Taehyung's comeback wasn't just a moment. It was a transfer of narrative custody. Custody transfers are not signed. They are recognized. And recognition had already happened globally. Meanwhile, independent media crews were now standing outside Liberty's gates holding umbrellas, notebooks, and a different kind of legitimacy. Legitimacy that did not come embossed, sealed, printed, or officiated, but lived in callous palms gripping cameras they funded themselves, questions they drafted themselves, narratives they wrote without corporate perfume, editorial delay switches, sponsor anxiety, consultant calibration, broadcast scaffolding, cue card trembling, segment trimming, emotional extraction, procedural moderation, irony framing, reputational engineering, investor soothing, crisis packaging, script smoothing, headline flattening, voice throttling, or narrative custody agreements that never belonged to the public to begin with at all. And Taehyung had become the signature on that transfer, simply by refusing to play small at all. By the ninth day of this narrative weather shift, institutions were no longer asking if celebrities understood politics. They were asking something more existential. How did a pop artist understand consequence better than our anchors understood audiences? Audiences stay not for competence displays. They stay for resonance. They share not for rhetorical correctness. They share for autobiographical recognition. They replay not for political lectures. They replay for fault lines that bend narrative hierarchies emotionally before institutions finish drafting their second paragraph at all. And Taehyung's words had bent the hierarchy calmly enough to echo louder in replay loops than any broadcast shout ever could. Liberty Now's ratings were not plummeting because of outrage. They were plummeting because of contrast fatigue, audiences realizing they'd been spoken at for years instead of spoken to. Contrast fatigue is not loud. It is quiet migration, the kind that empties newsrooms before it empties screens, the kind that empties authority before it empties ratings, the kind that empties narrative custody before it empties broadcast budgets, the kind that empties illusion before it empties apology packets written for forgiveness instead of memory at all. Taehyung had not destroyed a host. He had destroyed an assumption. Assumptions die fastest in contrast. Legacy lives longest in replay. And replay was now writing legacy for him.